Take two. United Launch Alliance's Atlas V rocket is back at the launch pad, and Boeing Starliner is once again poised to launch astronauts for the first time.
Butch and Sonny, I've talked to them, and they have every confidence in our spacecraft. They are definitely ready to go.
What officials with NASA, Boeing, and ULA are saying in the run-up to this historic mission. Fourth time's the charm? SpaceX is preparing for the fourth test flight of its massive Starship rocket from southern Texas.
Once they're able to get the soft water landing, then it's only a matter of time, really, before they do a return to launch sign and land on back on the pad where they launch.
The goals for this mission for both SpaceX and NASA is to work towards the Artemis 3 moon landing and Spaceship Earth. 2 climate monitoring satellites launched this week, with another on the way soon. The importance and impact of studying Earth from space. Joining us for insight and analysis are Mike Wall, Spaceflight and Tech Editor for Space.com, and Caleb Henry, Director of Research at Quilty Space. From the Spaceflight Now News Bureau at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, this is News from the Press Site.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Copies. On board the International Space Station.
And liftoff. Go Falcon, go Dragon, go Crew 7.
This allows us to go faster and to have better technology.
When we start putting humans on that vehicle, the excitement is even going to amp up even more.
Thanks for taking the time to answer our questions.
Hello there, and welcome to the latest episode of News from the Press Site, a weekly roundup of the week that was in space news, talking with some of the folks that cover the space beat. I'm Will Robinson-Smith, reporter here for Spaceflight Now. So good of you to take part of your day to get a little bit smarter on what's happening in the world of space news. And of course, we have a wonderful panel to break it all down with. Let's go ahead and start with our first guest. Mike Wall is the current Spaceflight and Tech Editor over at Space.com. He's been with the publication since 2010, covered a whole bevy of different topics, including, of course, space flight, the human endeavor, military space. He has a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Sydney, Australia, and we are very glad that he could be with us to talk about all the week that happened. Mike, glad to have you with us.
Sure thing. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And rounding out our panel today is our first, technically not a reporter currently, but he has spent quite a bit of time as a reporter and really carries that in his bones. I'm talking about, of course, Caleb Henry, who is currently the Director of Research over at Quilty Space. Back before that, though, he spent time between 2016 and 2020 as a staff writer for Space News. He also has a minor in astronomy. Really appreciate you, Caleb. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Will. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. And of course, as we are recording this, we are less than 12 hours from the launch of, or coming up on about 12 hours from the launch of Boeing Starliner spacecraft atop a United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket. This will be the 100th Atlas V. There was a press briefing earlier on Friday to talk about the readiness of NASA, of Boeing, and of ULA for this historic mission. So let's start by hearing a little bit from Steve Stitch, the manager of the Commercial Crew Program, about reaching this milestone.
I know it's been a long road to get here. It's really exciting for me to be here. It was exciting for me to, I got here just after Butch and Sonny arrived on Tuesday, and it was great to see them here. When the crew arrives, you know we're getting close to launch, and of course we got the vehicle to pad now.
And you see there photos of the vehicle at the pad, courtesy of our own photographer, Adam Bernstein, who is out setting remote cameras in preparation for the launch, which, as we're recording this, is set for June 1st at 12:25 and 40 seconds for those who really want to drill into the details and know the full nitty-gritty of the liftoff. So bringing our panel back in, and Michael, start with you since human spaceflight is really one of the things you like to focus on. This is a mission that's faced its share amount of delays and trials and tribulations. The fact that one of the things that stood out to me during the press conference was just the presence of Mike Fink, who's the backup pilot for this mission, bringing him out of quarantine, having him with the rest of us. Clearly, it seems like all of the major players here feel comfortable and confident with moving forward, barring some last-minute unforeseen, mishap. How are you looking at this mission based off of what we heard today and what you know about, where we are with the launch process?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like obviously they're still planning to actually launch tomorrow. We've been here before. Obviously, they were supposed to launch May 6th, and then that like try was was actually called off a couple hours before liftoff because of a valve on the Atlas V. And so people who are space fans probably know all this history, but it's sort of there have been so many delays with Starliner that you sort of kind of feel like I'll believe it when I see it when it launches, and it like hasn't launched in a couple of years now. I mean, 2022 May, I believe, was their second uncrewed test flight to the station. So it's been a long road to get here. They've overcome a lot of difficulties with the parachute system, with the wiring that they found was actually wrapped in some flammable tape. So they had to go in and actually remove a lot of that and then mitigate what they couldn't remove. So there's this whole list of things that they've overcome. So I'm sure there is some skepticism that it'll actually go off tomorrow because we've been here before and it hasn't done it yet. But I mean, like you said, bringing Mike Fink out, a real live NASA astronaut, like talking about it, it was a powerful visual reminder that yes, I mean, NASA's on board with this. There are people flying, and they seem confident that it's going to go tomorrow. They did spend a lot of time talking about the like helium leak, which was the latest reason for the delay that pushed it back to tomorrow. But it seems like they've analyzed that from every different angle, and they're very confident that the leak is very minor and doesn't pose any serious issues. And so, yeah, I mean, it looks like they are going to go tomorrow.
Caleb, bringing you into the conversation, of course, your focus is a lot on the business of space. This is an important mission, not only for NASA as part of the Commercial Crew Program, but naturally there's a lot of heat on Boeing on the airliner side of things. Certainly, as there have been delays with Starliner as well, a lot of pressure mounting to make sure everything goes as smoothly as possible. Given that this is a flight test that has been stressed multiple times and will continue to be throughout the duration of launch through docking and then landing ultimately, from a business case perspective, how vital is this that as much go right as possible for Boeing?
Yeah, good question. I think for Boeing, time is more of the essence now than perhaps it ever was to get this launch done. When the program began and NASA had selected Boeing and SpaceX to get started with this, I think there was an expectation that both companies would conduct a similar number of launches. But now, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe SpaceX is supposed to do 14 crewed missions to the space station, whereas Boeing with Starliner has 6 on the docket. That averages out to about one a year now until the space station retires. And it starts to look to me, human spaceflight is kind of not something that I would say is a strong focus at Quilty at this point in time. But that schedule, any additional lengthy delays might make it a risk to see how many times Starliner actually flies between now and when the space station is done. And then you kind of tie it into the broader portfolio of what Boeing is doing in space. The Delta rocket family is now retired. On the satellite manufacturing side, geostationary satellite orders, which was part of Boeing's core business commercially, is now down, not just for them, but for the whole industry. And the one area where they've got a good foothold now is continuing to do military satellite work. So I think if Boeing wants to have and maintain a robust and diversified portfolio of space services, that it's important for them to keep Starliner active, launching regularly, and hopefully once the space station is done, that they will find ways to continue to use that vehicle for future commercial space stations.
We'll definitely come back to that and certainly the topic of commercial space stations a little bit later on in the episode. But Mike, to you, want to cue you up with a clip here before we get to this next part of the conversation, talking about one of the things that Steve Stitch introduced, which was not just addressing the helium leak, but also connected to another mission that is not the Boeing Starliner, but actually Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket, which had its recent NS-25 mission, which hit a bit of a snafu with one of its parachutes as it was deploying. So let's go ahead and listen to this clip from Steve Stitch, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
Blue Origin had a recent human space flight, a suborbital flight, where they had a parachute that did not fully inflate. Starliner uses some similar components to that parachute system in terms of reefing line and reefing line cutters that cut that parachute system. Blue Origin provided some data from their flight, shared it with the NASA, shared it with SpaceX, shared it with Boeing. We were able to meet and go through the particular components on Starliner, and we made sure we had good separation from that particular parachute that didn't fully inflate. We went through and looked at all the data, and that's good to go fly.
So, Mike, to bring you back in there now, were you surprised when that part of the conversation came up? From my end, I wasn't really tracking the issue with Blue Origin's New Shepard parachutes as having a possible connection to Starliner. Were you thinking that this was going to come up as well based on your reporting? And what was your takeaway from the comments that we got on it from Steve and other folks?
No, I was surprised too, because I didn't know that they were that connected. They were talking a lot about the helium leak that seemed to dominate everything leading up. So this is, oh wait, so there's a connection to the parachute issue that we saw in New Shepard. That was not on like my radar either. I guess in like retrospect, it's not shocking because there are only like a certain number of sort of spaceflight vendors for a lot of these very specialty these like very specialty components. So it's not crazy that they're shared widely among the spaceflight community. But yeah, that I was not aware of that until this press conference today. And I mean, they've obviously they're probably not thrilled that they had another thing to explain, because they've just been explaining things for the past four weeks or so after the May 6th launch scrub. But I mean, again, NASA's very good at this. They're obviously extremely careful. I mean, all of these little issues are obviously magnified when it's the first crew flight of a new spacecraft, and that's what this is. So every little thing is going to be examined in absolute minute detail. So you can imagine that they like went over this with a fine-tooth comb, just like they went over the whole helium leak stuff with a fine-tooth comb. And I mean, NASA is very experienced with commercial crew, as we're now in the middle of actually SpaceX's 8th operational flight, which is and in stark contrast to where Boeing is with its first crew test flight now. But yeah, NASA like knows what things it needs to pay attention to and what are not as kind of crucial. So yeah, I mean, you just have to respect their process now, and that they are, I mean, take them at their word when they say that they will launch when they're ready, and they actually feel really ready for this tomorrow.
Yeah, and Caleb, just to round out our Starliner conversation, going back to more of the business case of it moving forward, Boeing's been asked a number of times in a number of different ways, what is the business case for Starliner once the 6 booked missions to the station are done? And they basically said in recent, weeks that our focus is on CFT. We want to get through this mission. We want to get through our contract with NASA, and then we'll really start to look forward beyond that. Sort of flipping that around, though, how closely do you think, some of these prospective space stations, I mean, I know there's been some talk in, the animation with the orbital reef station that is anchored by Sierra Space and Blue Origin, shows the Starliner is docking that. So presumably it would operate as a crew capsule there. But how much is the market really looking at this mission and, Starliner 1 as needing to work, on somewhat of a consistent timeline for what's remaining to have confidence in this as a business, case?
Yeah, look, I think the industry would benefit from having multiple suppliers in terms of transportation services to space stations. And historically, like the US found that through international partners. We had US space vehicles, had Russian space vehicles. Now, with the current state of just the geopolitical landscape, that is, I would say, a dwindling option. I know that crewed spaceflight is one of the few areas where there's some overlap and some collaboration still continues to occur. But I think for these commercial space stations, it'll be really valuable to have at least two commercial methods of getting to the space station. So I completely see why why you'd see Starliner in animations for these future destinations because we want to have more than one choice. And you kind of see that across the industry, right? The industry doesn't want to have just one rocket provider. They don't want to have just one satellite manufacturer. Anything, the industry does not like having this kind of monopoly because that doesn't do them well in terms of, pricing and negotiating and those kinds of things. So I think there's a broad expectation. Well, maybe not an expectation, like you said, Boeing has been coy about their long-term plans for the vehicle. But I think if they can really prove Starliner's success, that there will be a market waiting for them.
And we'll definitely be talking more about market dominance in another part of the conversation when we get to our Starlink breakdown, I should say. But speaking of things that start with Star, let's go to our next big vehicle with Star in the name. Of course, SpaceX's Starship, which is poised for a launch coming up no earlier than June 5th, of course, pending regulatory approval. This will be their second launch of the full Starship stack this year, aiming for, I think, about another half dozen if all falls well moving forward. So we actually had a chance to talk with Lisa Watson-Morgan, who heads the Human Landing System program with NASA, which is based at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. We'll have much more of our conversation posted up on the channel next week in the run-up to the Starship launch. But I just want to play a quick soundbite from her talking about some of SpaceX's process and looking toward what we can expect from the HLS SpaceX partnership in the next year or so.
This is a development program, and each test there will be additional things that they learn, and they're going to want to infuse that back in before they do the next one. So even if it's every 2 to 3 months, that's still quite an achievement for a test campaign. And each one of these tests will buy down different risks. And so again, we'll get to, for us, from a NASA standpoint, seeing each one of those launches, we'll get a little deeper insight into how all the engines act, how they're performing with respect to the ISP, and so we will have that.
And of course, one of the things that SpaceX has said and posted in their timeline for the Flight 4 mission is that it's really, much simpler than we saw with Flight 3. There's no trying to relight one of the Raptors on orbit. There's no header transfer of propellant operation. They're not going to try to open and close the PEZ door. Caleb, I want to start with you in this part of the conversation. We're going to talk a lot more about the business of Starlink moving forward, but obviously, a big pull in the tent for SpaceX's plan for Starlink is getting Starship operational. In your research and in Quilty Space's analytics, how key is the progress of this Flight 4 in getting as many of the milestones that SpaceX wants to accomplished? How big of a difference will that make in getting towards their ultimate goal in really expanding the Starlink enterprise?
Yeah, I think we remember a year or so ago when that kind of conversation came out. Musk was telling people they needed to come back and work on Starship to get the Raptor engine going because without the success of that engine and by extension the vehicle, that Starlink, the constellation, was essentially doomed to fail. That it was going to be in trouble. Uh, I think that today Starlink, certainly from our research, appears to be in a really healthy place, but there is still this vision of what comes next. So, Starlink has launched something like 6,000 satellites, and as they go up in generation, each satellite has got bigger in terms of mass. They started around 230 kilograms of spacecraft and then grew to 260 and then grew to somewhere between the 700 and 800 kilogram range with some variation based off of the iteration that they have and kind of the hardware that they put on each one. For the next generation of Starlink, we estimate that that satellite will be at least twice the size of the V2 Mini. And so that does make having Starship a critical piece of that puzzle. We're also starting to see with the V2 minis that they're putting on these direct-to-device antennas so that people's smartphones can work when they're outside of range of cellular coverage just by connecting to the Starlink network. And the result is that we're seeing fewer satellites per rocket as they roll out this new feature. So I think it becomes more important again as they try to scale up the satellites to offer higher speed connections for their internet subscribers, and then introducing this new service or any other service that they may want to add in the future. They need a rocket that can accommodate all of that payload.
Mike, bringing you in here on the conversation about Starship. We'll definitely talk more about Starlink as we go on this podcast. But were you surprised to see them scale back on some of their flight objectives with this mission? Or given what they were and were not able to accomplish last go around, does it make sense to kind of streamline things and sort of focus on, all right, let's simulate a soft landing with the booster. Let's simulate, the flip and a soft landing with Starship, did that sort of jive with where you think things were going with Flight 4?
Yeah, because I mean, this is not going to be the last test flight of the year. Obviously, I mean, they have so many they have so many launches planned for Starship that it's not surprising that they're not going to try to pack a bunch of stuff into this next one. And I mean, what seems to be the primary goal I mean, as said, but actually Elon Musk, he tweeted this like a little while back, like they're going to try to survive max heat on reentry with the ship upper stage. That's like the chief goal. So I'm not surprised that they're just going to focus on that and not deal with the stuff that they demonstrated last time. They actually said that they were successful with the payload door thing and the propellant transfer. So there's probably no need for them to sort of do that again. They didn't do the upper stage engine relight because ship was kind of rolling too much and it didn't make sense. So, but maybe they're not trying that necessarily in this one, just because they're kind of laser focused on this one thing that they want to prove, which is getting through max reentry heating. And they're probably going to be, if things go their way, if they can get all the regulatory approvals that they need, which is a big if, in the timeframes that they desire, they'll have plenty of time to kind of try new things on the next Starship flight and the next Starship flight, because there's going to be a lot of them in the near future.
And speaking of a lot, just to build off of that point, I mean, we're taking a look at sort of Starship's greatest hits in this B-roll package on the left of us. One of the things that they're trying to push for is, of course, having, Starship be operable here in Florida with up to 44 flights. Of course, the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, is taking a look at that feasibility right now and seeing, if there's a good understanding about Starship launching adjacent to Pad 39A and the Falcon 9 Falcon Heavy tower that's right there. Also looking at Pad 37 over at the Cape side. Caleb, how much of a impact and a difference? Obviously, they want to have these multiple sites to be able to get towards the Artemis goals of the on-orbit propellant transfer that'll make the human landing system functional. But how much does this impact the business side of Starship to be able to have, 2 towers in Florida, ultimately 2 towers in Texas?
Yeah, I think having more than one spaceport will, as they've said, increase the number of lanes that they have to get to space. And in order for them to reach the kinds of cadence that SpaceX has talked about, they're going to need that. So, frankly, figuring out some of the business model and the economics for Starship is a tricky business. Yeah, as you know, SpaceX is a privately held company. Described with their approach to rocketry and really, I think everything that they do is they have this goal of disrupting themselves. So they want each product that they roll out to render obsolete their previous one in due time, and not let competitors come along and take that role of introducing something that's more competitive and that they have to compete with more aggressively in the marketplace. So with that mindset of how they pursue technology and the launch cadence that they've already demonstrated with Falcon 9 and the vision that Musk has put forward for Starship, it's clear that they need multiple spaceports to get going. And I think it would be useful for them, especially as they're in this development phase, to have maybe one spaceport where they can do their operational missions, and then one where as they iterate on Starship, because they've shown the current version of it that's flying, and then they have plans for one that can launch even more. They talked about it being taller, having more payload capacity, reserving their Texas site for some of that continued research and development while operationalizing the Florida spaceport, or however they choose to do it.
And just to put a point on the Starship conversation for now, Mike, given the objectives that are ahead of them, given what we know about where Starship is right now, your predictions, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, on Flight 4, do you think they're able to accomplish everything given the tall order of that, making it through the re-entry point and surviving all of the heating with the tiles intact that they want to try to prove out? Do you think they accomplish that?
Yeah, it's I mean, like you tend not to make a lot of money betting against SpaceX. So and just in terms of yeah, their flight test trajectory, like the first one with the full stack, which was last April, it only lasted 4 minutes. They didn't achieve stage separation, but then they did get stage separation on flight 2, which was in November, and that lasted about about twice as long. Both the stages kind of detonated within 8 minutes or about 8 minutes after launch. Then in flight 3, they got stage separation and they got the booster most of the way back down to the Gulf of Mexico, like within 500 meters or so before it broke apart. And the upper stage ship flew for about 50 minutes and then broke apart coming back down to Earth. So they've made like big improvements on each flight, as they tend to do. They're very smart. They have very smart engineers, and they just iterate very quickly. That's the whole ethos of the company. So I would not be surprised at all if they get through max heating and do a splashdown with the ship and it like breaks apart on the ocean surface, which is probably that would be a huge success for them. And I would not be shocked if it happens. And then we'll see what the goal is for flight 5, I guess.
Only time will tell. I mean, we know they've already done a static fire of the ship for Flight 5, so it can't be too far off in the future, I'd imagine.
Right.
Well, talking about the launch vehicles themselves to what they have launched, it's actually been a pretty big week for satellites and spacecraft that are going to be observing our own spaceship, Earth. We had the pre-fire mission that launched aboard a Rocket Lab Electron rocket at the beginning of the week. Then we had on the West Coast a launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket that sent up the European Space Agency's EarthCare spacecraft. And in fact, as we're recording this, there's another pre-fire mission set to launch tonight. So Mike, start with you on this one. Obviously studying the climate has been a big priority for the current administration in the White House and for a lot of countries around the world, certainly in Europe. Is it surprising that we're really starting to see, or it certainly feels like a ramp up in cadence of these varying Earth observing satellites that are not just meant to image the Earth, but really study things like, with NASA's PACE mission, which launched earlier this year, that's looking at ocean color and plankton and algal blooms, to EarthCare, which is going to be studying, the clouds and, peering through them. Talk about this moment with all these spacecraft that are studying our climate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I am not surprised by it at all because, I mean, like you talk to people in the scientific community, earth scientists, people who actually study climate, they all agree that we need way more data to understand what the consequences are going to be of the warming, of the extreme weather that is currently ramping up on our planet. And there's been a scientific consensus on the importance of getting more data about that for years now. I mean, obviously, it's tougher to get the politicians to follow in line with that consensus, and it's extremely political, as we all know. But I'm not shocked at all that we see some of the cadence ramping up, because that kind of follows in like lockstep with the time cuts that are involved with getting some of these missions up now. You've got very capable launchers like actually Rocket Lab's Electron and like the Falcon 9, obviously. And it just doesn't take quite as long to build, or as much money to build, a very capable Earth observing spacecraft now. There are CubeSats going up. Actually, pre-fire that you just mentioned, Rocket Lab launched the first of the 2 pre-fire CubeSats earlier this week, and the second one is going up tonight. Those are CubeSats. They're about the size of a shoebox. So yeah, these are not like the Landsat spacecraft that NASA launched with the USGS or whatever, like kind of 20, 30 years ago, these giant kind of school bus sized things in space. These are more agile, extremely much more, much cheaper to sort of build spacecraft, and it doesn't take nearly as much time to get them up. So they're in a better position to sort of deal with this rapidly evolving issue with sort of rapidly evolving spacecraft that are very capable.
Yeah, and of course, the goal of, pre-fire, of Earth care, of pace, of, in fact, just I think it was yesterday or today as we're recording this, NASA announced that its Tempo payload, which was launched as a rideshare as part of the Intelsat 40E satellite last year, it started publishing its data, which is studying pollution across the United States, whether that's, particles in the air, or it can look at light pollution at night. Caleb, from a business case standpoint, this is important, obviously, not only for our own just sort of quality of life, but I imagine, having a greater wealth of information about our climate, about how all of these different forces of nature interact, is really a good way to have businesses think maybe a little bit differently about how they operate, on Earth, how we, develop communities. Can you sort of tie this all together, what's happening on orbit to really how the data gets used on the ground?
Yeah, so I think the theme that I've heard very consistently across the remote sensing domain over the past couple of years has been that of data fusion. It's combining information that you get from one type of sensor, maybe it's an optical sensor, with a hyperspectral sensor or a radar sensor, putting that all together to get a full picture. An example being like a radar satellite can detect a boat against the backdrop of water very easily. It's kind of like paint flecks against this black backdrop. And then you can task a traditional electro-optical satellite to go and take like a normal camera picture of it, and then you can identify the vessel more clearly. You put those together, and now you have more insight than you would have had from just one system separately. So one thing that I'm curious about is to see if missions like the Tempo instrument or EarthCare or any of these start getting combined with other data sets from private companies, as they look to do things like maybe track sources of pollution or just understand wind patterns or anything like that, how that is going to be involved. At this point, I haven't heard companies discuss very much the use of public data, of science mission data to those ends. But I think we're seeing a pretty rapid evolution, both in terms of how they're stitching that together, making use of technologies like cloud computing and AI to really tease out more insights than they had been able to in the past.
Well, that's actually a really good segue to a question I was going to ask you, Mike. You just had an article recently on NASA's town hall discussing, the use of AI, the possibilities, but also the precautions that NASA as an agency really wants to keep in mind as this burgeoning technology really starts to permeate all of our lives, and certainly, will have its place within NASA and some of the commercial partners that it works with. I don't believe, if I remember correctly in your piece, that they really delved into the intersection of, climate data with AI computing. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but, how useful of a tool do you think having AI is to Caleb's point of being able to really bring all of these different types of Earth sensing and observing features together?
Yeah, I think it's going to be huge. NASA officials have sort of stressed this same point like a lot in the past few months. I mean, AI is something that they've been using for like many years now. It's recently become a lot more sexy and a lot more kind of public facing with ChatGPT and all this stuff. Now everybody's talking like about AI and how competent it is and how it's changing so quickly. So NASA's investment and involvement with it is more interesting to people now. But they have generally been using like machine learning technologies for a long time now to do stuff like go through giant data sets like all the imagery captured by space telescopes and big telescopes on the ground. There's so much information in those, and it's just so hard to go through and find transients, find things that stand out against the background if you're just using human eyes. But that's what AI is really good for. That's what machine learning is really good for, is finding interesting things that stand out in a giant data set. And I mean, climate is the same way. There are giant data sets that come in from many different sensors, many different spacecraft. And yeah, I mean, NASA has stressed recently that they are using AI, and they anticipate it being even more important in the future, to go through these giant climate data sets to see what's interesting, what's standing out. And that's going to really help them like improve climate modeling. I mean, weather forecasting, storm predictions, all that stuff's going to be vastly improved by the increased use of AI as they're getting more and more data sets in. I mean, Caleb's talking about it. There's a lot of data coming in from many different sources. You know, it's not just government sensors. There are a lot of private spacecraft up there that are observing Earth now. You know, I mean, Planet has a constellation of like a few hundred spacecraft that are eyeing Earth all the time, and gathering lots of data that are very interesting to a lot of different customers, like including NASA and like other agencies like around the world, government agencies. So, I mean, I would anticipate AI is going to become even more useful and important to NASA as the data flood just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and very much harder to sift through using conventional means.
Yeah, and certainly as we are approaching, well, tomorrow is the start of hurricane season officially, which I know none of us here in the Sunshine State or along the Gulf Coast like to think about, but you know, the time to prepare is quickly winding down, and having more and better data is going to be better for all of us, certainly as we combat more and more severe storms. So, pausing from the conversation about the different things that we've talked about, Starship, Starliner, Earth sensing satellites. Let's talk about the vehicles that have launched them, right? Give a little bit of a rocket rundown, if you will. So this was the week that we had in orbital launches, and my goodness, what a week it was. There were about 8 different launches that went up in this time. So let's go ahead, run through them briefly. Starting with this, of course, we had the Starlink 6-63 mission kicking us off with a SpaceX Falcon 9 flight from NASA's Kennedy Space Center Pad 39A, sending up 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites. That was followed up by, of course, we talked about Rocket Lab's Electron rocket with the first of 2 pre-fire CubeSats. Just the one on this one. We'll have the second launching later on tonight. That was followed up by launch from North Korea, which, if you happen to see some of the video on social media, it lasted all of about 2 minutes or so before the first stage blew up. It was attempting to send a military reconnaissance satellite into orbit. That was followed up by a launch from SpaceX, of course, and a really beautiful launch at that, going up at 10:24 UTC. A nice shot collar there, as captured by one of SpaceX photographers, the Starlink 6-60. Moving on, we had previously mentioned Earth Care satellite going up from Vandenberg Space Force Base. So we'll go ahead and move on, since we talked quite a bit about Earth Care. That was followed up by a sea-based launch from Galactic Energy, one of their Series 1S satellites, on a mission called Beautiful World. And that was launching not too far from a cityscape. So really cool views for those living in that metropolis. That was followed up by a mission from Roscosmos, which is currently in progress right now, pardon the pun, but the Progress MS-27 spacecraft is currently making its way towards the International Space Station, set to dock just a few hours ahead of the launch of Starliner off of Pad 41 over here on the Space Coast. And of course, they want to see Progress dock before Starliner launches, just to make sure that there's not going to be any issues on station. Next up, we had another mission from Galactic Energy. This was a land launch that lifted off early this morning, and I believe this was the most recent mission that we had in the week, and that'll cap us off until we get to tonight, where we have a Starlink mission, another batch of Starlink V2 mini satellites, which is going to be sending up those 23 from Pad 40 over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So before we really delve into Starlink, to either Mike or Caleb who wants to jump in, was there anything about either the sheer volume of launches that we had this past week, or any of the launches in particular beyond those that we already talked about, that you want to just touch on real quick before we move on?
I mean, the only thing to say about the pre-fires, I guess, is how in quick succession they were, and how, I mean, the this second pre-fire launch tonight, I mean, they didn't even announce it. Rocket Lab didn't even announce the sort of launch date until a couple days ago, which is a little odd for them. I mean, it's not like they're secretive or anything. It was just like a different kind of mode of operations for them. I think just, I don't know if they're trying something out or seeing if they can do things on fast turnaround or faster than sort of usual turnaround, or if it's just that was just what was required for this mission. But I was just sort of struck by when they launched like the first pre-fire mission, they said that the second one would happen within 3 weeks or so, and it's happening within like 5 or 6 days. I just found that interesting that it was such a fast turnaround. I mean, I'm not making any or drawing any conclusions about it or anything. It was just sort of interesting to me that they're able to turn it around so fast.
I guess fortunate that they have their own private pads there down in New Zealand, and they can put one electron in one electron in the other, and say, cool, you go, no, you go. It's very SpaceX-like almost.
Yeah.
Caleb, anything jump out to you? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and turn to very much your expertise here with Starlink.
The only thing I'd add, which amusingly wasn't a launch in and of itself, but I found it interesting that the Pentagon or DIU, I think it was, awarded a small amount of money to a startup that is planning a sea-based platform for launch vehicles. I'm curious to see where that goes. We remember the sea launch mobile platform with the Zenit rocket that no longer really flies, but it's not an entirely new idea. I think that it's regained attention because of some of the success that China has had using a sea-based platform, and just some of the interest around maybe decongesting spaceports or creating other avenues to space. So I'm curious to see if this idea can get new life and kind of what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I'll definitely be curious to see if they, would be barging out the payload, or if they would get a rocket ready on land and then send it out to the seaport. I think it opens up a whole number of interesting possibilities. Speaking of interesting possibilities, though, want to come back to you, Caleb, to talk about some of the great analysis that you and the folks at Quilty Space did, really delving into the business of Starlink. I mean, you mentioned, this is a company that is fairly opaque as far as just about everything, honestly. They're not terribly disclosing as far as some of the things they're working on. Certainly, the finances are kept close to the vest. But in your analysis, you were forecasting what was it, 6.6 billion revenue projection. So, talk about the process of breaking down the Starlink business forecast that you were all able to present. And for those that were not able to watch your webinar presentation, we'll be sure to link to that in the description of this video. But let you just go ahead and take it from there, Caleb.
Sure. So, and yeah, that webinar is a half hour long, so I can't in any way summarize all of it right here and now. But a question that we at Quilty have gotten over and over and over again is, what is Starlink doing? How does the business work? Because they've been very, very disruptive. They came into this space in a way similar to how they disrupted the launch scene, kind of turned it on its head and forced everybody to up their own game to try and be more competitive, to now that they're being held, I should say, to this higher standard that SpaceX introduced. So we reached our estimates for how much revenue we think Starlink is making, and also its kind of EBITDA and profit based off of a number of things. It was what public data is available, including what the press, you guys, have reported. It was using our knowledge of various aspects of how much certain things cost, like how much a typical satellite costs, what we think it takes SpaceX to produce a satellite, which is definitely significantly below the industry norm. And then the same for all of the major cost buckets. So how much are they spending on launch internally? How much are they spending on their user terminals? How much are they spending on their gateways? What's their workforce? What percentage of the 13,000 or so SpaceX employees do we believe are dedicated to Starlink? And we estimated that it was about 3,000 of them. And you kind of pull all of these cost buckets together, and then put that against the revenue that they're generating from, at the time, it was 2.7 million subscribers. Now they say they have 3 million customers. And you can try to pull together a good estimate of how much revenue exactly they're creating. And our conclusions were that this year, 2024, was the first time that Starlink was actually able to generate a profit. You know, they've been working on this constellation idea since 2014. It's been a decade in the making, and these are massive, capital intensive programs, no matter how you slice it. But SpaceX has been able to really be effective in this area by aggressively vertically integrating just about everything that they've done. They build it all in-house, and they've really just pounded away at cost through vertical integration, through a level of scale that no one else in the industry has matched. And I'd say a very compelling and kind of unique first principles approach to everything, where they don't look at a particular technology or invention and say, this is how it's been done, therefore this is how we should do it. They ask, what are we trying to accomplish? And what's the best way? What's the cheapest, fastest way? Pick your goal to accomplish it. And then they go after it. And so that's resulted in some really unique design choices for their constellation that have helped them get as far as they have.
Yeah, and Mike, obviously, we've seen just in the brief rundown of the past weekend launches, the fact that we've got, a Starlink mission on the pad right now here in Florida, getting ready to launch later on tonight as we're recording this podcast. And, this week we marked I think it was the 5th anniversary of the first dedicated Starlink launch from back in 2019. Given that we've gone from 0 to them launching more than 6,500 in the total life of Starlink, are you surprised with some of the numbers that Caleb and his colleagues were able to synthesize from that? Or, just given the preponderance of launches that SpaceX is able to, put out week to week and, certainly keep us up at all hours of the night here at Spaceflight now, does it all just kind of, make sense that they've gotten to this point now?
It's really interesting, like you can sort of get inured to the Starlink launches. Like when we talk about this explosion of spaceflight, most of it is Starlink, right? We keep a running tally. I think there are 56 orbital missions by SpaceX so far this year, and I think 39 of them are Starlink. And so they're obviously extremely dedicated to building this out. And I mean, I'm not surprised, because when they set their minds to something, they go for it like 100%. And I do recall, when they first announced the idea publicly for Starlink, Elon said, this is what's going to allow us to fund Starship, or what I think it was still called BFR at that point. And this is what's going to allow us to fund Mars colonization, are the profits that we get from Starlink. That was the plan from the beginning. And so, yeah. I mean, I guess like I'd ask Caleb too, it's pretty interesting, right? Like, do you see them as on track? If this is the first year that they make a profit with Starlink, and they're very aggressive with their timelines for Mars settlement and all that too, wanting to do it within 5 years or so, or at least put people on in 5 years. Do you guys see the sort of Starlink profits getting to the point where they could keep funding Starship to the point where it could be a settlement vehicle, or is it too hard to kind of project that out into the future, 5-10 years or whatever?
So when Musk spoke in April, he mentioned briefly that they were using the revenue they were generating from their Starlink constellation to actually fund some of their rocket development. To me, that was the first confirmation that they have reached this goal. It was good timing for us as we're, putting this all together.
Yeah.
SpaceX is definitely behind the schedule that they had set for themselves. Some of those financials, I believe, were leaked to Bloomberg, and the figures that were espoused there, I want to say it was $9 billion, going from memory, but again, don't quote me on that. That said, even though they have not fully reached some of the goals that were set out early on in the program, they're still by far and away like one of the most impressive. We have them. By the way, if I didn't say, the 6.6 billion is our year-end estimate for this year, for full year 2024, and that would make them by revenue the largest satellite communications company in the world. Last year, you could put them in the running with, I think, Viasat, now that it is acquired Inmarsat, is somewhere between $4.3 billion in annual revenue. You combine SES and Intelsat, and it's around the same, somewhere in that kind of 4.2 to $4.4 billion of revenue. So they really have set a new high bar because their peer competitors in this space are consolidations of what have been the largest satellite communications operators in the world. And SpaceX is on track to still exceed their revenue by the end of this year. And so we do anticipate that continuing into the future. I think another thing that people have looked at is they say, oh, they put up these satellites, but then they bring them back down really quickly. And that appears to be more of an observation bias. I think the average lifespan of a Starlink satellite is over 4 years at this point. They tend to stay in orbit, I should say, for over 4 years. And it's a fraction of them that do come down earlier. It's just a much higher fraction than we as an industry are used to because nobody has put up thousands of satellites at once before. So they do look like they've closed in on more of a steady state type of operation. And then the question is, how much does everything change when they go into their next generation? And we at Quilty assume that they're going to go straight to a V3 because they've launched so many of the V2 Mini. And based off of the timeline that Musk had given at IAC last year, Starlink is expected to start launching its next generation of spacecraft, or based on that timeline, they should be launching them at the end of this year. We think that Starship remains a pacing item, but still within, call it the next 12 months, we could see the next generation of Starlink launching with those bigger satellites. And the economics of it may change a bit again then, but we know that they're certainly trying to push those economics further in their favor.
Last one for me, Caleb, before we pivot to our final story, if you can answer this briefly, just with some of the other players that are looking to, compete in the mega constellation space, talking about OneWeb and of course Amazon with its Project Kuiper, which is bringing to its end its proto flight satellites, going to be starting to launch its operational satellites later this year. How do you sort of see the level of competition between some of these mega constellations playing out, given where SpaceX will be, especially once a Kuiper, is really able to start coming on board en masse with their satellites?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and this is what makes it fun to be an analyst because we kind of sit and look at this for for a long time and try to come up with something useful for be it investors or strategic teams inside companies. Um, this is a recurring question at industry events. I'll try to keep my answer brief. I know you wanted this to be brief. It does look like there is a market for more than just one player. I mean, right now there are still dozens of satellite operators that are out there. They have not disappeared because Starlink exists. I think what has happened is that we have entered into a new, much, much more competitive era where people are going to be kind of pushing the goalpost and really trying to one up each other. And that's what's made for a really interesting development. So Kuiper, we expect to go forward and see some of their launches. I think this year, looking forward to the down selection for Gen 2 of OneWeb, and then to see MDA start cranking out Telesat Lightspeed satellites, as well as perhaps any other newcomers that surface or any domestic programs like the IRIS² network in Europe or any constellations coming out of China.
Going to be an interesting few years as we close out the decade to see what, low Earth orbit looks like at the end of the 2020s going into 2030s. Well, speaking of the end, we have somehow almost hit the end of our hour together. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot to our final story and just talk about this briefly. As we've been talking about the competition with the low Earth orbit satellites, there's also a competition to replace another important piece of hardware up there. That's the International Space Station. It's going to be coming down somewhere around 2030, a little bit after there. And you've got folks like Starlab, like you see here, with their proposal for a space station. You've got Axiom Space. They just released this image from Michael Lopez Alegria, one of their astronauts. This is part of their HAB-1, which will be launching in 2026. And then a little bit later on in this B-roll montage, you have VAST showing off their Haven-1 space station. All of them, looking to compete to be sort of the first to be able to replace the ISS. So, Mike, I'll start with you briefly here. What do you make of all of these different competitors for the ISS, replacement? Really start to put out, especially on social media, hardware like you see here with Axiom Space, some renderings and new commercial partnerships like with Starlab. Is it surprising that we're seeing all of this now, or does it feel like now is kind of the time to sort of put your cards on the table, as it were?
Yeah, I think it is time. I mean, it's time to show that you've made progress with your hardware because, I mean, you're talking about some of these dates. I mean, yeah, if Axiom like really does plan to launch their first module in 2026, right? That's not very far away at all. So it's time to start showing that you've made serious progress and that you've got real live hardware that is in development and in shape to be on the launch pad at that time. And it is exciting because we're not that far away from the ultimate kind of senescence of the ISS. We're talking about kind of end of 2030, maybe another year or so, but it started being built in 1998, right? So it's been up there for a long time. It's time to start kind of getting this like new generation up. And there are a lot of competitors who are vying for that spot. And I mean, I'm sure that not all of them will make it because that's just the nature of competition of capitalism. But it's cool that there are a half dozen or so that are fully in the ring, and that gives us a better chance of I don't know, one or two of them actually making it. So yeah, no, I think it's like a pretty exciting development that we're seeing some of the hardware.
Well, certainly we could talk about this and a whole bevy of other things, but we have somehow hit the end of our hour. So I really want to say thank you to the both of you. Definitely look forward to having you back on the show in the future. But before we let you go, want to ask you in turn, Caleb, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Mike. Where can folks find and follow your work? And what do you have your eye on in this upcoming week on the Space Beat? And I will just note, Caleb, you're also in the process of working on a book. So we'll be sure to link to the blog where folks can track that progress. But what else have you got up your sleeve these days?
Yeah, so the Quilty schedule is less newsbeat driven. I'd say we're continuing to focus on all the constellations, as well as doing some deep dives on the impacts of this consolidation that we've seen. I mentioned Viasat and Inmarsat. We're also looking at the Intelsat SCS merger and some of the implications that this is going to have for the industry. You can follow us at quiltyspace.com. You can follow me at Chenry Space on Twitter or X now. And then, yeah, there's also the blog for this book that I'm working on, which will do a deep dive into what it looks like to really get a peek under the hood at building a mega constellation, starting with OneWeb Gen 1.
Awesome. And Mike?
Oh, you can find me just go to space.com and just search my name. I'm on Twitter, or rather X, but I'm very inactive on it, so it's probably not even worth checking me out there really. I did write a book about 5 years ago about the search for alien life called Out There. I think it is still out there if anybody is interested in it, but yeah, that's about it.
Well, it was definitely not out there to plug that at the end. So folks, go get Mike's book at your local bookstore. Look for Caleb's when it becomes available. I'll certainly be in line to buy it. Fellas, really appreciate you joining us on the podcast today. Thanks so much.
Sure, happy to be here. It was a fun conversation.
Absolutely. Had a great time. And most of all, thanks to you for wherever you're watching this podcast from or listening to in the background of your chores or maybe driving from point A to point B. You can follow us, of course, here on YouTube. Just simply search for Spaceflight Now. We're also on X, Facebook, and Threads. Be sure to follow us for all of our live launch coverage. We've got Starlink tonight as we're recording this, Starliner tomorrow, and many more in the rest of 2024. So for Adam Bernstein, Stephen Young, I'm Will Robinson Smith. Thanks so much for taking that part of your day to be with us, and we will see you next time, folks, at Astra.